Before we begin, subscribe if you're drawn to the darkest truths. Like this video if you believe monsters don't always look like monsters. And comment below, do you think evil is born, or built behind closed doors? On the morning of August 13, 2018, the quiet suburban neighborhood of Frederick, Colorado woke to flashing lights and an uneasy stillness. The house at 2825 Saratoga Trail looked like any other. Trimmed lawn, white garage door, children's toys scattered near the driveway. Nothing about it suggested that inside, something irreversible had already happened. The man standing in front of it wore a plain t-shirt and spoke softly to reporters. His name was Chris Watts. His wife, Shanann, and their two daughters, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste, were missing. Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant. Watts appeared worried but calm. Too calm, some would later say. He told local news that he just wanted his family back. He asked them to come home. He insisted there had been an emotional conversation the night before, but nothing more. He said he had no idea where they were. To millions watching across the United States and later Europe, he looked like a distressed husband. His voice cracked slightly. His hands rested stiffly on his hips. He swayed back and forth as he spoke. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but investigators were already watching closely. Shanann Watts had returned home around 1:48 a.m. after a business trip to Arizona. A neighbor's security camera captured her walking up to the front door. That was the last time she was seen alive. By 8 a.m., Shanann's friend, concerned that she had missed a doctor's appointment and wasn't answering calls, contacted police. Officers arrived for a welfare check. Chris Watts let them in. The house was strangely empty. Shanann's phone was found inside. Her purse was still there. The girls' car seats remained in the back of the vehicle. There was no sign of forced entry. No struggle. No chaos. To trained eyes, it didn't look like a family that left voluntarily. A neighbor invited police into his home to review surveillance footage. The camera faced the Watts driveway. On the screen, in grainy black and white, Chris's work truck could be seen backed unusually close to the garage in the early hours of the morning. The neighbor stood behind him as the footage played. Watts crossed his arms. He rocked back and forth. He avoided eye contact. Later, the neighbor would tell investigators, he wasn't acting right. Police noted the same thing. As the hours passed, media attention intensified. Shanann had a strong social media presence. She posted videos about family life, pregnancy updates, and daily routines. Her sudden disappearance felt immediate and personal to thousands of followers. The case exploded online. Investigators learned that Chris Watts was having an affair with a co-worker. The relationship had begun weeks earlier while Shanann was out of state visiting family. Phone records showed long conversations late into the night. Text messages painted a picture of a man imagining a new life, one without the financial strain, without the responsibilities of fatherhood, without a wife, without children. When confronted, Watts admitted to the affair. But he insisted it had nothing to do with their disappearance. By August 15, the pressure was mounting. Detectives brought Watts in for a polygraph examination. He agreed. The room was small. Neutral walls. Fluorescent lighting. The kind of place where silence feels heavier than words. The examiner explained the process carefully. Watts nodded. He said he had nothing to hide. The results were immediate. He failed. The examiner told him directly, "I don't think you're telling the truth." Watts stared at the floor. His breathing shifted. The mask began to slip. In an initial confession, he claimed that Shanann had killed the children in a fit of rage after he asked for separation. He said he walked in on her harming them and, in a burst of anger, strangled her. It was a desperate attempt to redirect blame. Investigators didn't believe him. Hours later, faced with mounting evidence and emotional appeals from his father, Watts told a different story, the real one. In the early hours of August 13, after an argument about divorce and his affair, Chris Watts strangled Shanann in their bedroom. Their daughters were still alive when he carried their mother's body downstairs. He loaded his family into his truck under the cover of darkness. He drove to a remote oil site owned by his employer. There he smothered his daughters one by one. Bella fought back. She asked, "Daddy, no?" Those would be among the last words she ever spoke. Watts placed Shanann's body in a shallow grave nearby. He put the girls' bodies into separate oil tanks. When the confession became public, the reaction was immediate and visceral. The image of the soft-spoken father giving interviews on his front lawn was replayed alongside the details of what he had done. The contrast was chilling. In November 2018, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to multiple counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 5 life terms without the possibility of parole. He was transferred to a maximum security prison in Wisconsin for his own protection. The case shocked America not only because of its brutality, but because it dismantled the illusion of normalcy. The Watts family looked like countless others. Social media smiles, family vacations, ultrasound photos, matching holiday pajamas. There were no obvious warning signs to outsiders. Criminologists later analyzed his demeanor in interviews. The lack of visible panic. The odd phrasing. The mechanical body language. Many concluded that the signs were there, just subtle enough to miss if you weren't trained to see them. Across the Atlantic, European media outlets dissected the case with equal intensity. The narrative of the perfect family destroyed by hidden resentment resonated globally. It wasn't just an American tragedy. It was a modern one, amplified by cameras, timelines, and digital footprints. In the years since, letters written by Watts from prison have surfaced, offering disturbing details about his mindset. But no explanation has ever fully satisfied the public. There is no clear motive that balances the scale against what was lost. A pregnant woman. 2 little girls. A future erased in a single morning. The house on Saratoga Trail was eventually sold. New families have since walked through its doors. Children ride bikes past it. Life continues in Frederick. But for many the image remains frozen. A man swaying slightly on his driveway, asking for his family to come home, already knowing exactly where they were. And that was only the beginning of the cases that would shake a nation to its core. If the house on Saratoga Trail exposed the horror that can hide inside a marriage, the next case tore open something even deeper, America's faith in its own justice system. On the night of June 12, 1994, Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman were found stabbed to death outside Nicole's condominium in Los Angeles. The crime scene was brutal. Blood covered the walkway. A knit cap and a single glove lay nearby. Within days, suspicion turned toward Nicole's ex-husband, former NFL superstar and actor O.J. Simpson. At first he agreed to surrender to police. But on June 17, instead of turning himself in, Simpson climbed into the back of a white Ford Bronco driven by his friend Al Cowlings. What followed became one of the most surreal moments in American television history. The low-speed chase stretched across Los Angeles freeways. Helicopters hovered overhead. Police cars followed at a distance. Nearly 95 million viewers watched live as the Bronco crawled down the highway. It felt less like a manhunt and more like a national spectacle. Restaurants emptied. Offices paused work. People gathered around televisions in bars and living rooms. The country was no longer just observing a criminal case, it was participating in it. Simpson eventually surrendered at his Brentwood home. Inside, police collected key evidence. A bloodied glove matching the one found at the crime scene, blood drops leading away from the area, and DNA samples that prosecutors would later argue connected Simpson directly to the murders. The trial began in January 1995 and would last nearly 9 months. It was televised daily, transforming court proceedings into appointment viewing. The prosecution argued that Simpson had a history of domestic violence and had killed Nicole in a jealous rage. They presented DNA evidence linking blood at the scene to Simpson, Nicole, and Goldman. They displayed photographs of injuries. They laid out a timeline of events that seemed damning. But the defense, led by a high-profile legal team that included Johnny Cochran and Robert Shapiro, countered aggressively. They questioned the integrity of the Los Angeles Police Department. They suggested contamination of evidence. They pointed to past instances of racist behavior by Detective Mark Furman, a key investigator. The courtroom became a battleground not only over facts but over trust. Then came the moment that would define the trial. Prosecutors asked Simpson to try on a pair of gloves, one found at the crime scene and one discovered at his estate. The leather appeared tight as he struggled to pull them over latex gloves placed on his hands to preserve evidence. Cochran later delivered the line that would echo across decades, "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit." On October 3, 1995, the verdict was read. Not guilty. The reaction was immediate and deeply divided. In many predominantly black communities, the verdict was met with celebration. For some, it felt like a rare instance where the justice system did not crush a black defendant. It was viewed through the lens of years of police misconduct and racial tension in Los Angeles, particularly following the 1992 Rodney King beating and subsequent riots. In many white communities, disbelief and outrage dominated. The DNA evidence had seemed overwhelming. To them, the acquittal signaled a failure of the system to deliver justice. America did not simply disagree. It fractured. International observers watched closely. In Europe, the trial was studied as a cultural phenomenon, a case where celebrity, race, media, and law collided in ways rarely seen before. It was described as the trial of the century, not just because of who was involved, but because of what it revealed about the country itself. Years later, a civil trial brought by the victims' families found O.J. Simpson liable for wrongful death. He was ordered to pay millions in damages. The lower burden of proof in civil court, preponderance of evidence rather than beyond a reasonable doubt, led to a different outcome. But for many, the criminal acquittal remained the defining moment. The case permanently altered how America viewed forensic evidence. It accelerated the use of DNA in courtrooms nationwide. It exposed weaknesses in evidence handling and police procedure. It also demonstrated the power of narrative, how a defense strategy could reshape the interpretation of facts. Most of all, it showed how fame changes everything. Simpson was not an ordinary defendant. He was a former football hero, a charismatic broadcaster, a familiar face in commercials and films. Jurors were not just evaluating evidence. They were weighing the fall of an American icon. The trial also marked the rise of 24-hour cable news as a cultural force. Courtroom drama became entertainment. Legal analysts became celebrities. The line between reporting and spectacle blurred. In the decades since, the question still lingers: did the jury get it right? Some argue that the prosecution mishandled the case. Others believe systemic distrust of law enforcement shaped the outcome. Some see it as a triumph of reasonable doubt. Others see it as a miscarriage of justice. What remains undeniable is the shockwave it sent through the nation. 2 people were brutally murdered. A sports legend stood trial. The world watched. And the verdict left millions feeling either vindicated or betrayed. The case did not end with the verdict. In 2007, Simpson was arrested again in Las Vegas in connection with an armed robbery involving sports memorabilia. In 2008, he was convicted and sentenced to up to 33 years in prison. He was granted parole in 2017. For some, that later conviction felt like delayed accountability. For others, it was unrelated to the events of 1994. But the original case, the double homicide, the Bronco chase, the glove, remains etched into American memory. It forced the country to confront uncomfortable truths about race, celebrity, and justice. It proved that facts alone are not always enough to unite public opinion. And it demonstrated that in the age of cameras and headlines, a courtroom can become the center of a nation's identity crisis. 2 victims. 1 defendant. A verdict that still echoes. And as the country argued over guilt and innocence, another kind of darkness was growing elsewhere, quieter, more methodical, and far more difficult to understand. Chapter 3 would reveal a different kind of monster entirely. Some killers explode into violence. Others operate in silence. On July 22, 1991, a Milwaukee police patrol car rolled slowly down North 25th Street. It was just after midnight. A young man flagged officers down. He was barefoot, handcuffed, barely able to speak English. He was bleeding. The officers assumed it was a domestic dispute. The man they returned him to was quiet, polite, soft-spoken. He explained that the young man was his 19-year-old boyfriend. He said they'd had an argument. He showed them photographs, intimate images meant to suggest consent. The officers, uneasy but unconvinced of immediate danger, removed the handcuffs and left. They walked the young man back into apartment 213. They left him there. His name was Conorak Synthesumphone. The man who closed the door behind him was Jeffrey Dahmer. By the time police returned to that address the following night, the smell was unmistakable. Jeffrey Dahmer had been killing for years. His crimes did not begin in Milwaukee. In 1978, at age 18, he committed his first murder in Ohio. He picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, brought him home, and bludgeoned him to death after the young man tried to leave. Dahmer dismembered the body and scattered the remains. Then he stopped. For nearly a decade, there were no confirmed killings. But in 1987, the violence resumed and escalated. Dahmer targeted young men, many of them gay, many of them men of color, often from marginalized communities whose disappearances did not immediately command headlines. He lured them with promises of money for photographs or drinks. He brought them back to his apartment. There he drugged them. He strangled them. And afterward, he did things that would horrify even seasoned detectives. When police finally searched apartment 213 on July 23, 1991, they discovered Polaroid photographs inside a bedside drawer. The images showed dismembered bodies in various stages of decay. In the refrigerator they found a severed head. In the freezer, human organs. In a blue plastic barrel in the bedroom, 3 decomposing torsos dissolved in acid. Officers backed out of the apartment in shock. Dahmer did not resist arrest. He did not attempt to flee. He confessed almost immediately. Over the course of detailed interviews, he calmly described murdering 17 boys and men between 1978 and 1991. He admitted to necrophilia, cannibalism, attempts to create what he described as zombies by drilling holes into victims' skulls and injecting acid in a desperate effort to control them completely. His apartment became one of the most infamous crime scenes in American history. The public reaction was immediate and intense. How could someone operate for so long without detection? Why were previous complaints about foul odors dismissed as spoiled meat? Why had police returned a bleeding teenager to the very man who would kill him hours later? The case forced Milwaukee law enforcement into scrutiny. 2 officers involved in returning Conorak to Dahmer were initially fired but later reinstated after arbitration. The decision sparked outrage. In February 1992, Dahmer's trial began. He pleaded guilty but insane. His defense did not dispute the killings. The evidence was overwhelming. The legal question was whether he understood the wrongfulness of his actions at the time. Psychiatrists debated diagnoses: necrophilia, borderline personality disorder, psychosis. Prosecutors argued that Dahmer took deliberate steps to conceal his crimes, proving he knew they were wrong. After less than 6 hours of deliberation, the jury rejected the insanity defense. Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, totaling more than 900 years in prison. For many Americans, the details were almost too disturbing to process. This was not a crime of passion. It was not a single explosive act. It was methodical, repeated, clinical. And yet, neighbors described him as quiet, reserved, polite. He worked at a chocolate factory. He blended in. European media outlets covered the case heavily, analyzing it as an example of extreme deviance hidden within ordinary urban life. The idea that someone so outwardly unremarkable could harbor such darkness resonated far beyond U.S. borders. In prison, Dahmer claimed to have found religion. He granted interviews expressing remorse. Some believed him. Others saw manipulation. On November 28, 1994, just over 2 years into his sentence, Dahmer was beaten to death by a fellow inmate at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. He died en route to the hospital. His death closed the legal chapter of the case but not the cultural one. The building at 924 North 25th Street was demolished in 1992. The vacant lot remains. No memorial marks the ground. The victims' names are remembered by families, not by monuments. The case changed how missing persons reports were handled. It intensified conversations about how marginalized communities are protected, or overlooked, by institutions meant to serve them. It forced law enforcement agencies to examine bias, oversight, and communication failures. But beyond policy, the deeper question remained: how does someone become this? Dahmer described feeling isolated from a young age, fascinated with animal carcasses, detached. He spoke of a compulsion he claimed he could not control. Experts debated nature versus nurture, brain chemistry versus childhood environment. There was no simple answer. 17 lives ended. 17 futures erased. The cases that shocked America were not just about violence. They were about illusion, the illusion of safety, of justice, of normalcy. A smiling husband on a driveway. A beloved sports hero in a courtroom. A quiet neighbor behind a thin apartment wall. Each case forced a reckoning. And perhaps that is what lingers most, not just what happened but how easily it hid in plain sight. If history teaches anything, it is this: the most unsettling truths are rarely the loudest. They whisper, they wait, and sometimes they live right next door.